So if we're going to cast our mind forward and have a look at 2021 and beyond, the Roaring Twenties version 2, in terms of asset allocation, are there certain things that you've got your eye on or certain sectors that may perform better than others?
Yeah, the one that I've got the single biggest question mark over as we go into Christmas 2020 is office buildings. What does that look like in 2022? You know, I talked earlier about the government paying rent on office buildings, in a fund that I've got clients in, and they are paying the rent, and the 7% is arriving religiously, and the properties are being revalued. But what if the government decides more of their people will work at home in 2022? So that's the asset class that I'm most concerned about, is the office space market. There are other sectors of property like distribution and that whole sort of people ordering online and all of that, warehousing and distribution, that I think are better than office buildings. I believe that in 30 years, the banks won't be dominant in Australia. So across my client base, we're underweight banks. But I do think 2021 will be a good year for the banks. So we're certainly increasing allocations. But at the heart of it, Mark, is this. If the money's needed in 20 years and 30 years and 40 years time, i.e. super, I tend to dial up the shares and property, what we call the growth assets. And if the money's needed in the next 6 months, 2 years, then the asset allocation is dialed appropriately down so that you don't take on that market volatility. But the underlying truth is the same, that if you have a risk profile and a time horizon that suggests that is typical, let me use that word, that is typical. So you're accumulating super over the next 40 years, you should be invested in a balanced portfolio, possibly a growth portfolio. And my recommendation is, if you go for the growth in your super fund, don't look at it, or look at it once a year.
Yeah, and I guess you mentioned earlier on that not looking at sectors that perform, or understanding that sectors that performed well during 2020 aren't necessarily going to be the star performers of 2021, and probably some of the specifics around that, which you mentioned, IT, but particularly Afterpay is probably the one that everyone's talking about.
Yep. I can't buy it at today's prices. Even if it dropped 20%, I'd struggle to buy it for clients. And Mark, you know this, I love dividends. One of the things I love about dividends is the franking credits that you get with the dividends because that company has paid tax in Australia. That is at least half of the return of the share market. And it's the reliable part. It's the part that arrives regularly. And the wonderful thing about the Australian banks actually is that they pay in a different period to the rest of it. So you actually get an income during the year, and the hybrids as well. So I'm very focused on the income, rent, interest, and dividends landing in bank accounts. And yep. I think you should have all three. That's why I think you should be asset allocated. If you prefer property over shares, fine, but have some shares. If you prefer shares over property, that's fine, but have some exposure to property.
Yeah. And just quickly, do you have a view on the residential property market going forward?
Yeah, and it's changed. Bill Evans is the economist for Westpac, and he came out with this view a couple of weeks ago, or maybe 3 or 4 weeks ago, and I sat and thought about it quite hard. So I think I'm pretty bullish about the residential market in the next couple of years. The reasons are threefold. One is that interest rates are lower for longer. The Reserve Bank has said so. So we're basically saying zero interest rates. The second reason is the government has basically told the banks to throw out the rule book. Go and lend. All of that responsible lending, throw it out. And the third is that I think the economy is not going to be as bad as we perhaps feared in July. There is a vaccine, a cure. I don't know about a cure, but we are managing these outbreaks. Even in Adelaide, we're shutting down Adelaide for the right reasons. So I think people are feeling more confident about going about their daily lives. So the banks won't be calling in on problem loans that everyone thought they might be back in July. So I'm optimistic about the normal cycle that happens after a dip in any market.